the North Country, winter can seem never-ending, and that brings out my overwhelming desire to travel. On today's North Country Bookmarks, we travel back in time to places outside of the North Country, some close and some far, to escape. Our first author today is a Pulitzer Prize finalist and the winner of the National Book Award in 2000. Nathaniel Philbrick's most recent book, Travels with George, hit shelves in 2021. As we turn the pages, we travel with Philbrick as he takes the same path George Washington traveled when he was first elected president of the United States. With his wife and their dog, from the Potomac to Newport, Rhode Island, Philbrick helped me learn what a flawed and complex person our first president was. I started by asking why he felt compelled to travel the same path and write a book about it.
What else am I gonna do? I love to learn. I get itchy. I'm not the kind of guy who can just sort of hang out and have a pina colada and watch the sunset. I really enjoy just engaging with ideas and learning stuff I don't know. And what I love about history is, there's concepts, but there's also places and people. I read novels because I'm fascinated with human nature. And so when I'm looking at history, I'm really trying to find out, it's not just dates and whatever. It's, what were the people like? What was their character like? How did the land affect what they were doing? And that's why I love to, particularly with this book, to get out and see the country. For me, it's not just, being in my office or in an archive. It's actually seeing the land where this happened before. And so following George Washington's travels as president, as he tried to unite the country, was really kind of a culminating experience because, we were out there seeing all those taverns where he stayed. George Washington slept here. Well, it's not a joke, I'm telling you. This guy was working tremendously hard. One of the things I wanted readers to get was how far Washington traveled, not just in terms of the miles, but as a person during not only the presidency, but the Revolution. He starts out as a traditional Virginian slaveholder. By the end of the Revolution, he's beginning to change. He's beginning to realize that slavery cannot be the future of this country if we are going to be a true union of states. And yet, this is a man who became a slaveholder at 11. When his father died and he inherited some enslaved workers. And his whole household, including his wife, Martha, whose enslaved workers are owned by her dead husband's estate. It's a very complex issue. And so Washington, for me, was fascinating. He's not just the statesman. He's not just the general. He's a human being trying to grapple with, what is one of the central issues still today.
Even just in the preface, you said when he became the president, he was still wrestling with the idea of the meaning of the American Revolution. And he entered as a Virginia slaveholder, but by the end, he learned that his African-American soldiers were as competent and as brave as anyone else in his army. I feel like, not being a huge history student myself, I just think of George Washington as being, yes, he was the first president, but he was also a slaveholder, and therefore he was very bad. That's sort of like how I'm programmed to think, when in reality, he didn't want this. I think he felt very trapped. He knew that going into this, it was like a death sentence.
He didn't want to be, he was the most reluctant president we've ever had. He really didn't want to do this because he realized that the country was already politically divided. The Constitution had divided the country into those who favored a strong federal government and those who wanted the power to remain with the states. Some things have never changed. And he knew, yes, he was the most popular man in the world. And only he could be the one to create a sense of a nationhood. But he also knew that those political divisions were coming. He could only keep the lid on them for a short while, which proved to be the case. By the end of his second term, the partisanship divide was worse than we have today, if you can believe it or not. Right. More personal, more, just dirty. And Washington was deeply despondent and disillusioned. We now know that he had created a country that built to last, although sometimes you might have to wonder. But he had no sense of that accomplishment. He had that, it was for him just one thing after the other, trying to cobble this new concept of a democratic republic together with the issue of slavery dividing it. I mean, the thing of it is, he was a Southerner, but he really had the political agenda of a Northerner. The war had taught him that without a strong federal government, it's just chaos. And so, but most Southerners were on the side that Thomas Jefferson would ultimately hold, where the state should have more of the power. And so he's an anomaly, and not very comfortable under his skin. He's not that marble man. He's a soul grappling with issues that are divisive, personal for him, and still resonating today.
How long had you had the idea to sort of trace Washington's footsteps and learn more about his history?
It came to me relatively late. I was finishing up my last book about the Revolution. I was on a research trip to Providence, Rhode Island, when I went to the John Brown House, this magisterial brick mansion owned by John Brown, not the abolitionist, anything but a merchant and former slaveholder, a slave trader, who was one of the founders of Brown University. And he built this huge house. And in the back of it, it's now owned by the Rhode Island Historical Society. In the back of it is his carriage that he had, according to family tradition, Washington had ridden with John Brown when he was visiting as president. And I said, wait a minute, why was a newly inaugurated president in Providence? What was going on here? And that led me to realize, wow, he went on a tour of the country, visiting all 13 states in an attempt to unify this country. This was before mass media, before you could get on the TV and tell people what to believe. He had to go there and let people know that there's something more than your town, your state. There's also the United States of America. And so that's when I got the idea, hey, Travels with Charlie by John Steinbeck is one of my favorite books. What if I do my Steinbeck imitation and head out with my wife, Melissa, and our dog, Dora, and follow Washington's travels?
So this book obviously works really well. You wrote it in 2018, so this is pre-pandemic for the most part, and it's timely. If you had done this book in 2001 or 2008, do you think it would still be as timely?
No, because our travels began in 2018, as you said, and then I began to write the book. And when political divisions were out there, when we were the Confederate statues were a big part of what's happening to them. They're coming down, so those issues were out there. But then the pandemic hits while I'm writing it. Suddenly all that freedom of movement that we took for granted is gone, and then there is the unprecedented movement for social justice. Demonstrations all over the country and the world. And the issue of slavery is no longer, a part of the conversation. It is the conversation. And so suddenly all the issues latent in our journey are red hot. And it was like for me, it gave the writing of the book such an urgency. It felt like a vector into the molten soul of America as I was working on it. So it was a writing process like I've never experienced. So that if I had done this 20 years earlier, I think it would have been a different book. I think it would have been more of a lighthearted, we followed George and these are the stuff that happened. This book began that way, but as we, entered Rhode Island, which had, Rhode Island was the seat of the American slave trade. I think a lot of Americans don't get that. And then of course, moving south. And so this is a book that surprised me, not only during our travels, but as I was writing it.
Talking about Rhode Island, and that was something that I didn't know, that it was so central to slavery and slave trade. And now that, of course, that I've read it, I'm like, oh, well, that makes sense. And I thought, how serendipitous for you to be sailing into Rhode Island and having the tornado/hurricane.
Oh, right. I mean, Washington sailed from the temporary capital of New York to Newport. We decided we would sail from our home port of Nantucket. And as you alluded to, we encountered a tornado. and you can't make this stuff. I mean, we really didn't know if we were going to make it. But looking back, it is a metaphor for what we were encountering in terms of the history of this country. We were venturing to Rhode Island, and my wife and I had gone to Brown University. So, but we didn't have a full understanding of the complicity Rhode Island had in the institution of slavery. They were the ones, the Rhode Islanders, not only were slave traders, but their farms were supplying the South with the essentials they needed, since all of their agriculture was for cotton. And so, it's fascinating and disturbing to see how Rhode Island was interlocked with the Southern slavery. And so this begins us on a real change in our travels as we go from Rhode Island then to the South. The book moves into darker terrain.
Your wife, Melissa, and your dog, Dora, joined you on this journey. Did having them join you create any challenges in the creation of the book, or did it really just help?
Yeah, well, travel writers often say you got to go solo. That's what Steinbeck claimed, that, if you have more than one person, not counting your dog, that gets in the way of you interacting with others. I didn't find that. I for one thing, I spend all my time by myself in my office. I wanted to get out on the road. I didn't want to go aching with loneliness. I wanted to go with my wife, Melissa, who just retired. I was going to have some fun. But what I found was Melissa is a character in this book, and she is, I won't say she's a foil, but she's someone who would very often tap me on the shoulder and say, what are you thinking here, or what about this? And so I found that immensely instructive, and I think it's kind of an interesting part of the plot. Dora was always getting into trouble, and and some of it Washington related. A dog supposedly followed Washington during his southern tour. So anyway, so it made for me a really fun book to write as I was writing two narratives, our journey and Washington's, and interweaving them.
I loved that. There were 2 parts that really stood out to me. One was involving Dora, and it was right away when you're at Mount Vernon. And there's, no swimming signs, but Dora's looking at you like, but why can't I just go in for the water? It's very hot. I want to go in. And there's a blatant no swimming sign.
Yeah, well, and that she is a Nova Scotia duck tolling retriever, doesn't like it warm, and loves the water. And yeah, so Dora spent a lot of time wet. Needless to say, we needed to stay in only dog-friendly hotels, which created its own set of challenges. And it's just, I think you can take history too seriously. They're serious topics we're talking about, but geez, you just at some point you've got to see the other side of it. That it's the absurdity of it. And there's nothing like a dog to demonstrate the absurdity of your attempts to be serious as you investigate the historic past.
What state to you, and you can include Melissa's thoughts, obviously, but I want to know, what state was the most memorable one in your travels?
I think we look to the South. I mean, the Southern travels for us were so revelatory in all sorts of ways. When Washington went south, particularly as he approached Charleston, and then between Charleston and Savannah, it was wild still. The roads were terrible. There were very few taverns. In fact, in some instances, no taverns. He had to stay at private residences if he was going to have a place to stay at night. And there's one, Hampton Plantation, which is south of Georgetown and north of Charleston, where we go there, and it's this beautiful plantation with this huge live oak growing in front of the porch. And it turns out Washington was asked by the owner of this plantation if she should cut down that tree because it was so close to the porch. And he said, no, this is coming from the supposed feller of his father's cherry tree. And he says, no, it should stay. And to this day, there is the tree, this monster of a live oak, right in front. And it's a monument. It's a living monument to Washington. And, those were the kinds of experiences we were having on a daily, hourly basis as we made our way through the South.
Do you think you've shed light on who Washington was and the legacy he created?
Personally, I felt this was a different Washington from what I had come to know during writing about the Revolution. And when you look at him, as a president as well, or as a plantation owner, this was Washington the traveler, and we were traveling. So it was inevitable that we felt, I won't say a sense of kinship, but fellow travelers, and you'd get, narratives of a recount of a woman who, at 8 years old, watched Washington come by and help build the one-room schoolhouse across the street. I mean, this is not the Washington you think of, that marble man. This is someone who just rolling up his sleeves, enjoying being out there, out of the office and seeing the people and just having some fun. And so this was a different Washington, one that was the human being, the traveler.
Nathaniel Philbrick's Travels with George is now available at bookstores and libraries. When we return, we'll dine with some of the richest families in New York City as they tried to keep up with the Joneses. This is North Country Bookmarks.
Hey, it's Doyle Dean, host of the Dean's List here on NCPR. Join me Monday from 3 to 5. I'll be sharing some powerful, interesting indie rock from the Ukraine, along with what's new and what's great in the world of alternative music. That's the Dean's List, coming your way Monday from 3 to 5 here on North Country Public Radio and anytime at ncpr.org/Dean's List.
You're listening to North Country Public Radio. For more information about today's authors or to listen to previous episodes, you can head to ncpr.org/bookmarks, or you can subscribe to the program wherever you normally get your podcasts. Today's programming is supported by The Book Nook, an independent bookstore located on Broadway in Saranac Lake, on Facebook at SL Book Nook, and by Brewer Bookstore on Park Street in Canton, open to the public Monday through Saturday, featuring books, household items, and gifts. brewerbookstore.com. Now back to North Country Bookmarks on NCPR.
You're listening to North Country Bookmarks. Whenever people ask where I'm from and I respond with upstate New York, I'm greeted with asking how far from Buffalo or Westchester I am. Needless to say, it takes quite a while to make it into Manhattan from Canton, so I was grateful to read our next author's book, The Social Graces. The Gilded Age showcased some lavish events and personalities, and two of the women leading the pack were Alva Vanderbilt and Caroline Astor. Throughout the 3 decades the book covers, we learn how money can't always buy you happiness, but it can help change society for the better. I asked Renee Rosen how she got her start in historical fiction as a whole and what led her to New York City.
It was sort of a happy accident. I had always had this fascination with the Roaring Twenties, which is sort of how it all started. And I spent 10 years researching Prohibition Chicago. And after I wrote Dollface, which is the story of a flapper who falls in love with 2 mobsters from rival gangs in Prohibition Chicago, the book did well enough that my editor said, give me another Chicago historical. And it just sort of went from there. And then after, I think it was 4 Chicago historical novels, I moved, I said, I need some new territory. and then I moved to New York. Not physically, but, my work moved to New York.
You've also penned a young adult novel.
What's the biggest difference in writing a young adult novel versus a fiction novel for adults?
That's a very good question, because when I wrote Every Crooked Pot, I had written it as an adult novel. And this was coming out right around the time of Harry Potter. And so the publisher was looking to really cash in on that sort of crossover appeal. And the biggest difference was I had to change certain references in Every Crooked Pot. For example, I had a lot of references to Al Jolson in there. And they're like, yeah, nobody's going to know who Al Jolson is. So I had to switch that to The Wizard of Oz. It was a book in a way about a love letter to my father. And my father never owned a belt. All he wore were Sansa belts. And they're like, nobody's going to know what Sansa belt slacks are. So there were certain references like that I had to tweak. And there was also no looking back. The character could not look back on her childhood. They wanted the reader to feel her experiences as they were happening. Does that make sense?
It totally does. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I tried to do another young adult. I have no inner child, I'm convinced. As some people say, I just am a child. So I'll never say never, but I don't see another young adult novel in my future.
Do you have a particular time period that you personally like writing about the most?
Well, let's see. I mean, I've now written about the Gilded Age twice, which I just love the dresses and the excess and all the etiquette and all the nonsense that goes with that time period. But I do have a soft spot for the Roaring '20s. I just think that was a great time for women and just a fun era to explore.
You must have to take such a deep dive into research to write your books. What was the research process like for Social Graces?
Because we're going back into the 1800s and because etiquette was everything during the Gilded Age, especially for ladies in society. So I had a stack of books about 4 feet tall that I would reference for, everything like, how did somebody drop off their calling card? What was the proper etiquette for hosting a dinner party? How was your stationery different for your country home versus your city home? I mean, it got very particular. My research always starts with reading, and I try and get a foundation. And then whenever possible, I want to go and see it, touch it, feel it. So we went to Newport, which was the summer vacation spot for the upper crust. They spent anywhere from 6 to 12 weeks there in their, quote, cottages that were actually 50-room mansions. We toured the Marble House, which was Alva Vanderbilt's cottage, and walked Cliff Walk, and just really tried to get a feel of Bellevue Avenue, where these society ladies would do their little parade down Bellevue Avenue every day. And then we went to New York. Unfortunately, there's not a lot left standing in New York to represent the Gilded Age. For example, Cornelius Vanderbilt's home is now Bergdorf Goodman. Caroline Astor's original townhouse is the Empire State Building. But I did go to the Historical Society there, and I did go to Trinity Church, where there's a monument to Caroline Astor there. And, just really tried to get my head in that time period and what it would be like for women living there.
Old money versus new money is pretty central to this time period, and especially in New York City. Which family, old money or new money, was the most surprising to you in your research?
Wow, let's see. What was surprising to me was Caroline Astor. She was the Mrs. Astor, the reigning queen of society, and she represented the old money. She was a descendant of the very first Dutch settlers of New York, and that was the equivalent of royalty. And what surprised me was that in the beginning, before the nouveau riche or the new money came on the scene, the Knickerbockers were very understated. They thought that Worth gowns were really gauche, and their homes all pretty much looked uniformed. They didn't do this lavish entertaining. A party favor may have been flowers for the women as opposed to diamond necklaces, which it became later on. And so they were very refined. And it really wasn't until the Vanderbilts and the Carnegies, the JP Morgans and such came onto the scene that it was a bit of the tail wagging the dog, where suddenly it was the Knickerbockers trying to keep up with the nouveau riche. And I found that really surprising to see how that trend evolved, because I had just always assumed that they started off with these 9-course dinner parties and balls that went till dawn, and it really sort of ramped up.
Was there a particular character that you felt most connected to when you were writing Social Graces?
Let's see. I felt connected to bits and pieces of them. For example, Caroline Astor is, she's 20 years older than her rival Alva Vanderbilt, and she's kind of facing like she's sort of at the prime of her life and the prime of her power, and she starts to feel it slipping away. And as a woman getting older, I could relate to that. And then Alva, just her drive and her hunger. I loved that about her. I loved how unconventional she was. I've done a few unconventional things, so I connected with that. And I just had so much fun with these characters, and getting to know them.
There are a lot of different marriages in the book. Divorce is
Yes.
explored. True love is explored. Which relationship was the most enjoyable to pen?
I loved the James Van Allen and Emily Astor. And just to sort of lay the groundwork for that, Emily Astor was Caroline's daughter. She was her oldest daughter. She was, expected to marry a certain type of man. But instead, she falls in love with a guy, James Van Allen, who is a member of the nouveau riche. So he's new money. Not only that, he had gone to Oxford for like a short period of time and came back with a phony British accent and an eyepiece. And, forget the fact that they all spoke with very heavy mid-Atlantic accents. Everybody sort of criticized him for trying to pass himself off as a Brit. And I just love the dynamic of how he came to win over, sort of say, the Astors and finally get their blessings to marry their daughter. And it was truly a love match. And I think it took a long time for people to recognize that. So I had a lot of fun with that relationship. Alva and Willie K, that was great fun because he was such a playboy and she just wasn't about to have it. So many women and wives just, turned a blind eye. Oh, my husband's having an affair. Oh, well. And Alva's like, not on my watch. This is not happening.
For most of the book, it was like keeping up with the Joneses. At the end, however, we see women becoming more vocal, becoming philanthropic, and wanting to give back. Alva, in particular, transforms. What do you hope that the reader learns most from this book?
I think what I hope is that that they see the evolution of these women who really, they had nothing. The only reason they got up in the morning was because of society. What else were they going to do with their day if they weren't going to plan 9-course dinner parties? So it gave them a purpose. And I hope that readers will be less judgmental of that and a little bit more sympathetic to understand that was all they had. Was society. They had to create something out of nothing, or else their lives had no purpose. They couldn't vote. They couldn't work outside the home. They couldn't own property. They had to ask their husbands and fathers for just about every cent they spent. And so I hope that it sheds some light on that. And I also hope that we've come through such a horrific year with COVID. And I really hope this book provides a nice escape for people, because I think that's what we need right now.
For me, watching the growth of Alva and watching her not take no for an answer. And she's so smart because she can manipulate her father-in-law and all of these men. And she wants to have a voice and she wants to be like raising her hand and saying, this is why this is the right thing to do. I found when she was going to the one gala, she exits her carriage and sees all of the people standing outside of the hotel who have nothing, and she feels guilt. Everything that you want a reader to get from this book was everything I got from reading that part in particular.
Oh, I'm so glad. Yeah. You know, that was the Bradley Martin Ball, which was really the beginning of the end of the Gilded Age, because they just choked on their own conspicuous consumption at that point. You know, this was a ball that cost millions of dollars to throw. Every guest was assigned their own footman. They had, cigars that were wrapped with $100 bills as, just thank yous to the men. People's costumes cost more than families had to live on for 10 years. And the public just said, enough is enough. You're gluttons.
What are you working on now, Renee?
Oh, I'm really excited. I don't have a title for it yet, but it's a novel about the cosmetic icon Estee Lauder.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm having so much fun with it. It starts in 1938 when Estee Lauder was making face creams and lotions out of her kitchen in New York and then selling them in beauty salons up until the point in 1946 where she landed her first major account at Saks Fifth Avenue. You know, she had a very interesting past. She claimed that she had been born in a castle in Austria. She was actually born in Queens. And, she sort of fabricated her past to, elevate it to this glamorous world that she was aspiring to be in. So she was a really fascinating woman, a trailblazer. She invented the whole gift with purchase, and nobody dared to apply makeup in a, department store until she came along and started. That was the way she sold. She had to touch your face,
Renee, I really loved The Social Graces. I think it was a really amazing book, and it was definitely an escape, taking me to New York City in a different time and less contagious place.
Well, thank you, Jessica. It's been great talking to you.
Renee Rosen is the author of The Social Graces, Park Avenue Summer, Dollface, and many more historical fiction books, as well as young adult books. When we come back, it's time for summer camp and learning how one family's life was changed after a summer of discovery. This is North Country Bookmarks.
Hey, it's David Summerstein, NCPR news director and host of our afternoon news show, Story of the Day. And you might be wondering, what happened? Where'd you go? Yeah, we moved Story of the Day to 548 as a part of All Things Considered. And if you can't stick around for that, we have you covered. Listen to Story of the Day as a podcast whenever you want. Automatically download it to your device of choice or just by clicking play on the website. Go to ncpr.org/SOTD for the podcast of Story of the Day. And of course, it's coming up on the radio pretty soon at 5:48 p.m. Sounds good? Email me if you have any questions, david@ncpr.org. Thanks a lot.
You're listening to North Country Bookmarks here on North Country Public Radio. Today's program is supported by Renew Architecture and Design, offering custom design services from the St. Lawrence River Valley to the Adirondacks. More at renewarchitecture.com. Today's program is also supported by CCOM Credit Union, serving the financial needs of people throughout northern New York and Vermont. In person, online at ccom.org, and on your smartphone. Now back to North Country Bookmarks here on NCPR.
Welcome back to North Country Bookmarks. I'm Jessica Lawrence. I don't think I'd like to jump off the cliffs of Stoughton Island right now, But give me a few more months and I'll happily jump into the St. Lawrence River. So it was a real treat to read our next book, The Best Part of Us, taking place on an island in a pristine northern Canadian lake. The author has a background as an environmental journalist and worked as a public affairs officer for the U.S.-Canadian Boundary Water Organization. And she uses her background with the environment to create a rich, descriptive story. When Beth's grandfather asks her to return to the island that she once loved to determine if it should be sold or kept, she's forced to confront the past, including one summer when a discovery changed everything. Loyalty, family, and nature all shape the book and help me to feel as if I, too, were diving with the loons. I asked Sally Cole-Misch what led her to write a book after a lengthy career in journalism and public policy.
I had a career 30-plus years as a journalist and then as an environmental writer and advocate and writing Great Lakes policy and so deeply embroiled in the environmental arena. And I have always loved to read. And so I had done all this research in the 70s and 80s. We really pounded people with all the scary things about what we were doing to the environment and what it was doing to us as a result. And we realized pretty quickly that that really wasn't working as far as a message. And so we started looking at all of the research studies that showed that how important it was to connect people to nature first. And when you do that and you help them to see the value of nature in their lives and how interconnected they are with it, then you're able to really get a little deeper into the issues and how our lives might be impacting those issues and what we can do to change. I actually was out in a beautiful place of nature that I love reading. And I started thinking about all the ways that reading itself helps me, just the same way as being in nature helps us. It lowers our blood pressure, it reduces our cortisol stress levels, helps us feel part of something bigger than ourselves. There are just so many different ways. And when I researched fiction, it was exactly the same results as far as how we're absorbed into other worlds and feel so much a part of things. So as my son went off to college, I jumped in, even though I was working full time, and went to the Stanford online master certificate program in fiction. And it was really intense, but it really taught me the basics of how to write fiction. And so by the end of that program, I had a pretty solid first draft. And then I just kept rewriting. I went through probably 11 drafts. And so I just kept going until I felt like I had something of substance and that it was really meeting the need that I had for writing the book.
Can you describe the best part of us?
Oh, wow. That whole line has always been so hard for me. I think that the best part of us is a story about a family's deep connection to a special place and to nature. It touches on sibling rivalry and family secrets and betrayals. It's really a coming of age story. The best of intentions for each family member works into the collective worst of outcomes. And they're each forced to decide where their loyalty lies and what is most important to them to bring out the best part of themselves.
You were a journalism major at Mizzou, and you have a master's degree in environmental education and international water policy from Michigan. Which of these paths do you think were more influential in the penning of this novel?
Wow, it's a tough question. I think probably all of them. I think it's probably a collection of my education and my career experiences, but also my own deep love of nature and place. And I wrote while the storyline and the plot, the characters, everything has nothing to do with me or my life. The setting, I know by heart. I can close my eyes and feel and taste and smell every part of it. So I started there because I knew that would help me to really show the deep connection with nature that I was really trying to get across that this family had with this lake and island.
I love how you were able to bring in the complexities of nature, diving with loons, fishing one-legged seagulls into the book. Did you have a special place that you would go to when you were writing this book?
No, as a matter of fact, because I was working full time and my son played baseball in college, I wrote wherever I had a chance. And a lot of times that was sitting in the car driving for 18 hours or wherever we were to his baseball games. I did have, my office looks out in a lovely setting. So a lot of times on the weekends, I'd be able to look at that. It really was more for me being able to close my eyes and picture the setting of this novel that really helped me. And then also, our family has always taken vacations to somewhere in nature, national parks or, recreational things, hiking, skiing, whatever. So I'm just being part of nature and out in it is pretty easy for me to conjure up.
I actually got goosebumps when you mentioned that, because as someone who has a place in the Thousand Islands and grew up every summer going to our summer house in the Thousand Islands, the way that you wrote it made me feel like you were actually there. And I'm flabbergasted to learn that you didn't actually, that this isn't a place that you actually went to repeatedly, because you write it so well that it makes me feel like you're writing it from memory, that you've been there, that you've had these deep experiences there.
Well, thank you. That's really nice to hear. And the Thousand Islands is such a gorgeous part of the country. Yeah, I think places just get in deeply into your soul like that, don't they? I'm sure that you can close your eyes and picture your summer place and smell it and hear the waves and lapping on the shore and all that sort of thing as well. So, but thank you. That was really my first intent with this book, was really to help people connect to nature and consider the places that are important to them.
Native American traditions and culture play a large and important role in the book. How did you do research for this aspect, and was it difficult?
It wasn't, from the aspect that through my work, I've worked with First Nations and tribes in both countries quite a bit. And so I had a lot of personal connections that I could call on to help me, make sure I was being accurate with their culture. But I felt that because First Nations are such an important part of the culture and history and still very prominent in that part of Ontario, I couldn't imagine writing a book set in that location, or actually even in the Great Lakes, without including that. Mm-hmm. And it's also because the Indigenous culture, especially Ojibwe, their entire culture is based on their connection with nature and the spirit of nature and how it, their responsibility to it. So I wanted that to be a real juxtaposition to some of the family's perspectives. And actually, when I first started identifying the characters, I did them based on how connected or disconnected they are with nature. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the Ojibwe at one end to all the way to Kate, the mother, at the other end, and everyone else in between.
Was it difficult for you as the author to sort of get into that dark, sad headspace?
It was, and there were parts of the book that really surprised me. One of the first exercises I had in the Stanford program was to sit down and have all your main characters write a letter to me. So I sat in my library for 11 hours, closed my eyes, and just started free writing these letters. And the first sentence was, "Dear Sally, there's something you don't know about me." And except for the main character, Beth, I didn't have a clue what any of the other letters meant. So I didn't expect some of the things to happen in the story, but as I sat down to write different scenes, those characters, they had a reason for pushing it in different directions, which I think is what most novelists will say is so exciting about writing fiction. So yeah, it was, but I think it also, the more I understood, the characters were really pointing out, especially in her brother Dylan's case, of just how far down you can go when you're not loyal to yourself and what is the best part of yourself, and how far he had to fight to get back to being where he loved and being himself.
We see the importance of families and quality time as a family in this book. in what ways did you see this, need for quality family time change over the course of the book?
I think, I do recognize that the story is kind of a slow start, much like novelists of, long time ago, like Wallace Stegner or something. But I felt like I needed to do that to really present those kind of quality family times, and so that you have a sense of how deeply bonded this family is to each other and to that island and lake. So once you see how tightly that bond is, then you can understand how hard it was for all of them, once these worst outcomes happened, to find their way back, and how long it can take. It's interesting, in a lot of book clubs I've had, where people really could understand Dylan and had examples in their own lives of people they knew that had just gotten lost along the way, that they just were, society or other pressures or whatever, they just kind of, whether it's physically or not, they kind of disappear.
What has been the most rewarding aspect of publishing The Best Part of Us?
Talking with readers. Actually, I have done a lot of book clubs. I'm so grateful that people are seeing the connection with nature, that they enjoy that part of the book the most. Some of the questions, as far as, like you say, the family actions and the grief and how the story progresses, is really interesting and intriguing. But I just love the look in people's eyes when they start to tell me about their own special places in nature and how it feeds them. Then I am able to say to myself, okay, this is accomplishing what I set out to do, is to try and help people connect with nature, and then take the next step of thinking about their role as part of this whole natural world.
Why do you think this book has been so popular in Canada specifically?
Well, it didn't start out that way, but I think it's, mainly, just because of my publisher and how the publicity went and that sort of thing. But, as well know from living where you are, there are so many parts of Canada that are so beautiful and have these gorgeous lakes. And that is so part of family connections and history, isn't it? Is having these summer cottages and really enjoying summer for the short months that they have it. Canadians that I know have a very simple connection with nature. They're happy to just go to a nearby lake and enjoy it. In America, so much we use all the national parks, and we all go there by the thousands, especially with COVID and everything. So it is a quiet book, and I think it kind of reflects their perspective about nature, perhaps.
I happen to have a fondness for books that don't tie everything up. And I think that you succeeded in doing that. So the one thing that I have to ask is, do you see this being the end of the story for this family in particular?
Wow, that's a great question, Jessica. I have gotten that question from a lot of people, and I've really pondered it. I don't, it's just their characters are still talking to me a lot, and we'll see what happens, I guess, is my best answer.
I also just wanted to say, I can recall very vividly growing up wanting to be included and go in the boat with some of my older friends from the river, go to Brockville, Ontario for a concert, or, just go across to go get dinner. I wanted that so desperately. I wanted to be one of those big older kids. And so I really found myself relating to Beth. And she wanted to grow up. She wanted to be there. And her brother and sister sort of sheltering her, sort of, making it so she stays young and innocent. And I appreciated that. But watching her grow up and being brave as she had to be with her grandfather, and really standing strong on her ground about, the right thing to do. This is what we should do. We shouldn't lie. We should tell the truth. We should, it was a good thing to watch a child go through.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it comes back to that whole idea of not wanting, I wanted it to be a really realistic family. I wanted it to not, there's, in how many families is there truly one bad guy, right?
Mhm.
And I think the relationship with Dylan and Beth is just gorgeous. As that developed, the sense of caring, I don't have a brother, but the sense of caring and mutual respect that they have for each other and their goals. And you could also see why Beth, the more I understood Kate, the more I saw this makes sense, that Beth is strong like this, that she's willing to stand up for what she thinks is right. And boy, every family has that sibling rivalry, right? And that, I want to go do what you're doing. The youngest always feels that way. So that part was really fun to really try and represent a family in all of its complexities, the good times and the bad.
While we might be stuck at home surrounded by snow for a little bit longer, you can pick up any of these 3 books featured on today's episode and take a little trip outside of your house. You'll feel refreshed for making it through another few weeks of winter. Music on today's episode was by Chet Faker, Evan Veenstra of Gananoque, and Jacob Yeager of Canton. North Country Bookmarks is produced and edited by Ethan Shanty, with Bonnie North as executive producer. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast wherever you get your podcasts to listen back to old episodes or for exclusive podcast content. For North Country Public Radio, I'm Jessica Lawrence.
You've been listening to North Country Bookmarks here on NCPR. To listen to this program again or to hear previous episodes, head to ncpr.org/bookmarks. You can also subscribe to the program wherever you normally get your podcasts. Today's program has been supported by Island View Funeral Services, Morristown, NY. Individualized funeral services designed to meet the needs of each family, islandviewfs.com. Support also comes from Planned Parenthood, providing confidential supportive counseling, education, advocacy, and a 24-hour hotline through their sexual assault services program in Clinton, Essex, and Franklin counties. This is North Country Public Radio.